China does not have the capacity to take Taiwan without inflicting such a blow on itself that creates a crisis of political leadership. Can, for example, hold on to power if that many young people have just died in an invasion and the economy is in shatters because of that. And so China would prefer then that Taiwan is intimidated and takes the view then that resistance is futile. So there's no point in preparing for an invasion, that we should be negotiating for peace already.
The Sunday Times' Josh Glancy has been observing military training exercises in Taiwan and reports a heightened atmosphere of tension. I'm joined now by Brian Hioe, the founder and editor of New Bloom magazine, which is based in Taipei in Taiwan. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for coming on. Tell us, I've been to Taiwan, actually. I went about 10 or 15 years ago. It is a wonderful place. It's a fantastic country, and it's a proper democracy. I mean, you've just had elections. Tell us what the mood is at the moment.
Yeah, the mood is actually rather calm. I think oftentimes when people come in from abroad, perhaps they will perceive a sense of elevated tension, but that's not necessarily the case. Taiwan has faced military threats for decades. We just had an election, and so it is possible that China will react in some way in the coming months because the election outcome did not go the way China would have liked it. But that is normal, and I think that's people are relatively calm then in Taiwan.
And this, what I found fascinating when I went to Taiwan is this relationship between China and Taiwan, the people. So you will have thousands of Chinese tourists coming to Taiwan every day, and it doesn't feel like they're coming to a country and saying, this is ours, it's outrageous. They're just coming because it's a wonderful place to visit, and obviously culturally very similar. So what is the relationship between sort of Chinese people and Taiwanese people?
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up because currently there are not Chinese tourists in such numbers anymore. This is because China decided to stop that. They preferred to economically pressure Taiwan by cutting off the numbers of Chinese tourists. And then, of course, COVID happened and there were no tourists. But it's a complicated relation in that sense because majority of the population are descended from people that came to Taiwan from China hundreds of years ago. And there are a 2% indigenous population. There's also those that came from more recent waves of migration with the KMT to Taiwan after the Chinese Civil War. But then Taiwan now is economically in many ways dependent on China, despite China posing such a geopolitical threat to it. And so it's a kind of contradictions. There's many layers to it in that sense.
Exactly. There's a lot of trade between the two countries, despite the extraordinary rhetoric.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it is a question then, particularly China will use this as a way to apply pressure to Taiwan without resorting to conflict, for example, because if China prefers it, they would rather take Taiwan without having to expend such loss of life or cause so much destruction.
So the other paradox I find in the relationship between China and Taiwan, obviously the rhetoric from China has increased exponentially, particularly obviously since President Xi took power, and it's fairly uncompromising. Taiwan is part of China. We will take Taiwan back by using military force if necessary. And yet, at the same time, China must know that an invasion of Taiwan, first of all, would not be easy. It would be extremely costly in human life and expensive. And it would devastate world trade, which could only have a massive impact on China, which already has a struggling economy. How do you reconcile those two positions? The fact that the invasion of Taiwan almost seems inevitable from Chinese rhetoric and yet would be such a catastrophic move.
Yeah, exactly. And I think actually they are interrelated in that sense because China does not have the capacity to take Taiwan without inflicting such a blow on itself that creates a crisis of political leadership. Can, for example, hold on to power if that many young people have just died in an invasion and the economy is in shatters because of that. And so China would prefer then that Taiwan is intimidated and takes the view then that resistance is futile. So there's no point in preparing for an invasion, that we should be negotiating for peace already. And so in that sense, a lot of China's efforts directed towards Taiwan are psychological in nature, psychological warfare, one could term it, in the sense of preferring that Taiwanese not put up any fight and just view things as dangerous, and Ukraine or other examples in the world as negative examples of the futility of resistance.
So Josh Glancy did observe military exercises in Taiwan. I mean, it is a serious, leaving aside the issue of nuclear weapons, which I'll turn to in a moment, but the Taiwanese armed forces would put up a strong fight against China, despite being massively outnumbered. They do have a state-of-the-art military, and are obviously, it's their territory. They know how to defend it. What do you
Yeah,
think?
absolutely.
What would I mean? It's a slightly crude question, but how would a war with China play out in military terms?
Yeah, so I think the thing that about the Taiwanese military is that it literally has one enemy and it's had decades to prepare, and that is, of course, the PLA, the Chinese army. And there's only certain times of the year in which the sea conditions are right for an invasion. There's only certain beaches in Taiwan that are large enough to accommodate a landing force. And so there's been a lot of preparation then, or a lot of thought to that. If, of course, if China decides to throw its entire military at Taiwan, pound for pound, there's no way to outfight a country that is so much larger by many orders of magnitude. But China would not do that. And the logistics of taking an island are very difficult. It's a an operation on a scale of perhaps D-Day. And so it'd actually be very difficult for China. Despite being massively outnumbered, then Taiwan does have geostrategic advantages. And there's also technology, but also that it is something that people would fight dearly for. It is home after all.
Does the issue of nuclear weapons ever come up? Do the Chinese hierarchy, military or political, ever say we're prepared to use a nuclear strike against Taiwan?
It never really comes up in the discourse, but then there is that concern of escalation. One sees with Russia as well in Ukraine, the potential then that Russia would resort to nuclear arms. It would not occur at the drop of a hat. There's also shakeups in the rocket force, for example, of the People's Liberation Army currently. There were issues with rockets that reportedly had water instead of oil in them to be fired. And so I suggest there's some issues there. It'd be an extreme measure, and it would definitely shift the geopolitical balance of the region a lot. There's already concerns from other countries about the rise of China, its threats towards Taiwan, but also if it took Taiwan, then it could pose a geopolitical threat to the rest of the region. And so regional tensions as a whole would be dialed up enormously if nuclear weapons are on the table.
Absolutely. And what is the American presence in and around Taiwan like at the moment?
So America does, of course, have bases in the Asia Pacific, in Japan, the Philippines, and so forth. There's talks, for example, with the Philippines now of a base that's 200 kilometers away from Taiwan, port rather. And so that's a new development. But then there's also an informal ties between Taiwan and the US that extends to defense cooperation. There are trainers that are from the US military in Taiwan for Taiwanese special forces in recent times, but that is not at a number that is significant in terms of, let's say, an actual fighting force. Oftentimes symbolic. But the US does provide arms to Taiwan through arms sales, and it is a question how it would react in the event of invasion, but there is certainly US presence in the region.
Brilliant. Well, Brian Ho, thank you so much for coming on the show. That's Brian Ho, the founder and editor of New Blue magazine, which is based in Taipei, Taiwan, talking about the cover story on the Sunday in the Sunday Times magazine today, which you can obviously see on your app as well if you subscribe digitally to the Times, which is written by Josh Glancy about the military training exercises going on in Taiwan